you live in the world of ideas, you want to make the world slightly better through your ideas. But those ideas will age and move on. So we're building on the shoulders of those who came before us.
Welcome to The Endgame by Clear Estate, life's final chapter discussed openly. I'm Davide and In these conversations, we get real about estates and legacies and our efforts to disrupt old systems with technology, a bit of humor. And as always, I'm joined by Sara, our resident Empress. I love it. I love this one.
What am I today? Okay. Got
Estate
it.
Empress. Estate Empress. That's the one we settled on. So today we're talking about legacies. We're talking about business legacies. We have Karl Moore who's joining us. Karl, I mean, everybody knows Karl in Canada, but for those who don't, he's a McGill professor, teacher, management, and somebody that knows like pretty much everybody. Like he's basically interviewed every CEO on the planet in the past like 20 years. No, it's insane. And he's thought a little bit about what it means to be a good CEO, what it means to be a good leader, and what it means to develop the next generation.
Yeah. Carl's super interesting character. I love to hear him talk. I could listen to him all day, talk about all the amazing people that he's met with and got to interview. But definitely a lot of super interesting insights. And that I think, apply in terms of business strategy, but just in general, like he's on the forefront of a lot of the trends that we see in business, but also in families.
Please don't forget to subscribe to The Endgame by Clear Estate on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. Here comes Karl Moore on our podcast. Karl Moore, an old friend, old professor of mine at McGill University, truly one of Canada's most trusted voice on matters related to strategy, management, and CEOs in general. Because I mean, Karl, like I don't think anybody in the country has met more or knows more CEOs than you. Is that correct?
I think so, David. There's few advantages to being older. One is that you've done something longer than other people. And so in my PhD at York and University of Toronto 30 plus years ago, I interviewed CEOs for my thesis. Then went to England. At Oxford, I taught executives and CEOs, and then started a radio show 16 years ago. I interview a CEO every week, and then I have a CEO Insights class, which I believe you took, and I think your wife as well. So it's
Yes.
a small world. And so I do about 80 CEO interviews a year. Sometimes it's, someone like yourself I've done before that I come back to, but, as 70 of the 80 are probably new. And it's a wonderful opportunity. And something I didn't realize until I'd done it, that I'd interviewed Justin Trudeau, Mohammed Yunus, Nobel Peace Prize winner, President of Bangladesh, and Sir Richard Branson by chance. And I don't have to say, and who are you? After mentioning I've interviewed those three, because you don't outrank those three unless you have the in the title, the Pope, the King, the President. So you have to have the in your title, because you go, even those, I think the Pope would go, actually, Richard Branson is a pretty good artist. Like, and he'd go, actually, yeah, they're better than I am in their field. Like, they're great people. So it opens up doors. So I've interviewed probably about a little over 1,000 CEOs and other leaders. Like I interviewed the Vice Prime Minister of Vietnam. So he's not a CEO, but it's fine. And Melanie Joly.
That qualifies.
Yeah, what we're looking at senior leaders and having a talk with them. So we get ideas, and quotes from very well-known people with a lot of responsibilities for our various books. And within reason, I can ask them pretty much anything, and because they're going to edit it afterwards. And I don't ask, hopefully, too many dumb questions or too personal.
And what are people thinking about this year?
Well, I mean, mental health is a big one. Doing another book with a guy, Frank Colmar, who was the head of L'Oreal Canada, then ran 10,000 people out of L'Oreal Paris, but his wife and kids were in Montreal. So he took early retirement and is now co-teaching my CEO class. Here's the idea. It's a sporting metaphor. That you go from playing in college ball to the NBA, the game speeds up. And so we're saying that you got to slow the game down. So I interviewed some great athletes, and we did some tennis players through Frank, and our co-author in the U.S. did some basketball players and all. But how do you slow the game down? Because you go from I asked Ken Dryden his most memorable game in hockey, and here's a guy with 6 Stanley Cups. So and he said the most memorable game was his first one with the Canadiens in the old Forum. And David, you're old enough to remember the Forum.
Yes.
And he was called up he was a McGill law student, and they called him up as the backup goalie for the Canadiens. It was early in the season, perfect record, no losses, and they were playing the Sabres, no losses. But the intriguing thing is that his older brother, was the goalie for the Sabres. And this is before Google. It's an old story. The coach was an old guy, said they've never had two brother goalies play each other. And he's an old guy. We believe him. Like, okay. And Mr. Dryden is there in the audience. And so they announce it, and they put a spotlight on Mr. Dryden, and everybody applauds. Everybody had the same question. What do you feed the boys of the Dryden household? I want to feed my kids the same. And so the goalie gets injured, so Ken gets sent in, and the other coach sends in his brother. And it's the perfect ending for Mr. Dryden. Tie game. This is before they went to overtime. Tie game. Neither of his sons loses. And his brother calls him over, and no goalie does this. Like, you don't go see the other goalie. You don't, but it's your older brother, 6 years older, calls you over, and the crowd goes nuts. Because it's a moment of NHL history. And they hug each other. And it's wonderful. So that was the most memorable game. It's interesting because I asked Matt Darsh, who was Canadians and then the coach of the Islanders, his most memorable game. And it's an interesting thought when you talk to athletes. But, it's an interesting question. What is your most memorable deal? What stands out? What is the most interesting thing that you've done? So that's one of the other questions. Mental health is one. I mean, the question of the age is, what are you doing about AI?
Mm-hmm.
And every single one, like 4 years ago, they go, we're looking into it. Because their board had asked them, and the board realized they had not looked into it, but they would now. And 6 months later, the board could ask them. But today, AI is the question. So at my age, I'm not worried about it. But we worry about students using AI to write exams. So there's some legitimate things there. But as certainly go, they're going to use AI in their lives, like if they use it in an exam. But we want them to get it in their head so they actually know it. But AI is the big topic du jour. No, I forget the French expression for the decade, but it is the question du jour, which is not just the day, obviously. It's a bigger thing than that.
In that context of a world that is sometimes feels like it's spiraling out of control, or it's hard to develop a strategy, how do you think CEOs today think about their legacy?
The legacy is: are you leaving behind an organization that will survive and prosper in a perfect? That's what you'd love to do, but it's also: are you building an agility into the system? And a third thing is, are you creating young leaders that will be tomorrow's leaders that can deal with it? And it gets back to two of the big schools of thought of strategy that you learned when you were at McGill. One is Henry Mintzberg, my most famous colleague by far, who has more emergent strategy. Then there's Michael Porter at Harvard, who has top down. And it's funny because I ran into one of my students. I said, what class are you going to? And he goes, well, it's Robert David's class on the 5 forces. And it's the whole semester where they look at various frameworks. And I teach Porter stuff myself. And McGill gave him an honorary doctorate a few years ago. So I got to interview him for an hour one-on-one. This is as a strategy prof. I know Mintzberg is a friend, been to his house many times, but I'm sitting one-on-one with Michael Porter. And, it's a great opportunity. So there's top down, bottom up. And when I ask CEOs how they do strategy, it's both. And the emergent strategy is saying, I need to listen to young people, frontline troops, who are dealing with the harsh realities of today's world and get it. Where if you're that CEO over 30,000 people and you have a corner office in the 6th floor, in a huge office, you're cut off from reality, is the danger. And they recognize that, but you need to go out there and regularly sit down and be reverse mentored by young people and taught about today's world is what you need to do.
you teach young people, and I think you've done a lot of thinking around how older generations should perceive Gen Zs and millennials. Do you think that in most CEOs' heads, the idea of developing a new layer of leaders amongst these young people is part of how they think about their legacy? Do you think that's something common in all CEOs, or do you think that's unique in highly successful ones?
I think it's a bit more unusual, unfortunately. And part of what the messages I'm giving out to the world is, I'm older than most people, but my workforce is younger than yours unless you're on a McDonald's. I literally have 8 students, 10 hours a week that are teenagers. Like I remember a couple of years ago, I was saying to Sienna, I said, Sienna, as a teenager, she go, I'm not a teenager. I said, how old are you? She said, 19. I totally won that argument. But she said, I don't feel like a teenager. And I go, okay, fine. I'll give you that. But it's something where I have a young workforce who are really, really clever. So it's great to learn from them. And what I say to them, that 30% of the time you're mentoring me. Now, and I say to my class, and they all smile, big smiles, they're quite happy this thought. And I said, what's the flip side? And I've never had an undergraduate get it right. That 70% of the time I'm mentoring you, and don't you forget it. So, it's a two-way street, but more me. But I have a couple of mentors in their 80s. It would not occur to them to ask my advice. Like it just mentoring in their generation was rightly, and they are incredibly accomplished people. So I don't disagree, but I need to have people correcting me, keeping me aware. But to do that, you need to approach them and ask them and listen with rapt attention and do something. Because if I ask your advice and I never follow it, you go jerk. Don't bother asking. I hate you even more than if you'd never asked. But it's something where, like my books, the latest one was, she's now 24. We spoke last a week today at the Senate in Ottawa. And it was a great honor. And there was dozens of senators there and staff, a couple hundred people, I guess. And she came in by Zoom. And it was great because I have the old white guy down. Like, that's me. And what can I do? It is who I am. On the other hand, she's a young woman from Vancouver. So she brings generational and gender perspectives that I don't have. And my other books are all done with younger people. And like the one I did came out about 3 weeks ago, a 21-year-old who's at McKinsey, her name's on the front of the book because it deserves to be, but it means that it makes my thinking better. So you got to listen to young people and spend a lot of time, but at a certain point, I'm the CEO, I'll decide. And sometimes you go, Sarah said one thing, David Day said something else, and they totally contradicted. So I've got to go, okay, what's the arguments? And my book is called Generation Y. And one is they want to know why. And I explained to them, as if I explain, here's what we're doing, they might go, Karl, that's fine, except for, did you think about this? But if you just say, here's what I've decided, no one can argue with it as easily. But if you explain why, you can get into a conversation. And I've got to ask why a lot more than in the past. And from that, I'll learn things, but I'll still decide. So there's a comfort there for the senior people that you're the boss for good reason, more or less. That you've got the experience, you've had the success. You don't make CEO if you weren't a good salesperson, then a good sales manager, then a good VP of sales, or whatever you went through. So you've learned something, but in today's VUCA world, you must listen more than in the past. That's simply required in the vast majority of industries. And I think a number of CEOs fall short that way because they're a bit stuck in the old way of doing things, partly because when they were young, that's what a CEO did. And therefore you follow that when you became, more senior executive and you looked at the person above you and did what they did because that's what a CEO did. But in a world that's moving, we got to move on a bit and got to get into something. We got to be a bit different than we were 10, 20 years ago.
Do you think that the definition of success for young people has changed over time? Do you think people perceive things differently? Like, how did the motivation of young people and their attitude towards their careers changed over time?
Well, it's interesting because I tell my students that as a boomer, when I was young, we measured ourselves by the kind of car we drove, what neighborhood we lived in, and how nice was our suit. And it was that was the view that was the definition of success. But it was boom times. We didn't worry about the environment enough. It was all about us. It was about ego too much. But in today's world, if you measure yourself what kind of car you drive, you may fall short because one, you shouldn't be, like we don't own a car. We use common auto, car sharing, but we live downtown, so that's very helpful. And I try to get 10,900 steps a day. Not having a car is extraordinarily helpful with that. When I talk to my neighbors, but like I walk to work or take the metro and I get 7,000 steps just taking the metro to and from work and home. So, but it's redefining what is success is the world's different and it's harder to get that kind of financial success. And if you measure yourself by where you live, we have a house in lower Westmount, like 3 doors from St. Henri. So it's upper St. Henri, which is, Westmount's an expensive neighborhood. And we are in the most furthest end down in a townhouse, but we could not buy that house today. And our children just go, well, we can't afford Westmount. We grew up there. My wife's a grade 2 teacher in the local French school in Westmount, but they just can't afford it. So you got to redefine success because if your success is getting a house in Westmount and driving a BMW, 99% of young people will fail. And that's not psychologically good. So you have to redefine it. They've also added environmental issues, rightly so. They've invited the treatment of women and minorities, rightly so, absolutely overdue. So they're looking at a more nuanced view of what is success, where the boomers were money. How much money you made was for too many people central. But even then, back then, the vast majority of people of immigrants were, like my dad was a janitor. He couldn't define himself by money, but he was a janitor in Toronto. So it's something where the boomers had kind of a time in history where it was a great time to be alive and be educated and that sort of thing. Today's world is more challenging, and you got to somewhat define success by what you can, through hard work and determination, achieve. So it's a different game today, rightly so. I admire them for it, and I'm trying to be like them.
Talking about legacies, you're talking about the boomers. We tend to do a lot of boomer bashing in our society right now. Like, and you hear a lot of it.
Well, we don't hear it because we can't hear anymore. That's a fair point.
What do you think is a positive legacy of the boomer generation?
The he who dies with the most toys wins attitude, which we just talked about, is passé and gone on. The boomers in our better moments started thinking about the environment and starting becoming concerned about the environmental impact of things. And my students largely believe this is the world's biggest problem. And poverty is, if you live in many parts of the world and so on, it may be a privileged view, but people are going to die. And Florida looks like it's going to be really flooded. Now, in some sense, as Canadians, we go, if it's warmer and we can grow further north in Quebec and Ontario, this is good news. It seems like Canada is going to gain from climate change, but you go, it's going to be bad too. So flooding and all that. So you look at that there's really a hard edge to climate change. It's not just, oh, you should be for this. This is going to hurt people's lives. And a fair number of young people I know wonder if they should have children. Because do you want to bring a child into a world that is going to be horrific? And I don't know if people during World War II probably thought about that. Particularly if you're Jewish. Like, do you want to, like, can you bring a kid into this evil world would be a genuine question. But that's part of it. And, I say to them, relax. Family is one of the most valuable things. If you're blessed to have one, that is one of the most important things in life. Go forward. And I have a naive optimism. Maybe it's a boomer thing. On the other hand, I'd rather be you and 20 and have hair than be my age, but it's not on offer. Like no one's going, okay, you can switch. I mean, there's movies about it, but it sadly doesn't happen in real life. So you go, you got to be optimistic and positive and hopeful is the message the boomers and the Gen X has got to pass on to the younger people, because I think it's the right message. And there's some positive indicators out there. Like we genuinely seem doing some stuff around the environment. We genuinely are doing that. But still, it's going to be the big thing we got to work on a lot more than we have. And when I travel with students, we're trying to make our hot cities trip, which was last one was Cairo and Morocco, carbon neutral, so that you can't travel unless you make up for the carbon emissions. On the other hand, it's great that we travel and see the world and it expands young people's and my mind. So it's a great thing to do, but make it carbon neutral. So, and issues of equity are on their minds as well. Like EDI is not popular in some parts of the world, but there's some central messages which are helpful that we should not be judging people on gender or race or things like that we have in the past, and we need to get away from that. And that's another message that really resonates with young people. So when you talk to them, there's some of these things are just seems to be built into them, and this is the way they view the world, and largely entirely correctly. Now, there's a German. I know two German words. One is Schadenfreude, which Germans tell me I'm mispronouncing, but it's an inappropriate pleasure in someone else's suffering. And what I realized that when they have teenagers, they will be criticized by their teenagers, and rightly so. But it's just the nature of the younger generation and so they'll be criticized in their time. So they'll do good things, but they'll fall short in other things, and their teenage children will talk about it. I remember talking to one woman who had a teenage daughter and had been complaining, and she complained to her mother, and her mother said, "You were worse." And she was horrified to go, "No, really?" And she said, "Yeah, I know you and I know your daughter. You were worse." And, just horrified by the thought. But so there'll be a time when they criticize us rightly, but they'll be criticized too. So keep that in mind, that the sins of the next generation will, still be, lust and greed and so on, but there'll be other things as well. Like, we didn't worry about the environment when I was young that much. And chemicals were poured into the St. Lawrence and stuff that's horrifying today by our standards. So what is needed evolves over time, and we'll see what it is in 30 years. It'll be entertaining to find out.
How do you think about your own legacy, Carl?
Well, as a teacher, it's about students and what I leave with them. And I have coffee with all my students in groups to get to know them as people. But I was just talking to Cal, who is a former student from 20 years ago, who's over in Manila. And one of the questions I've been asking people for years, I asked CEOs, what book are you reading? Because we might want to buy it. And Mark Perron, who runs CAE, I've known him for years. A couple of years ago, I said to him, what book are you writing? And he went, what? Like, what did you just say? And I said, Mark, I think there's a book in you. And everybody takes it as a compliment. But I asked Cal, I said, Cal, have you written a book? He said, no. I said, Cal, there's a book in there because of what you've done. And I said, here's what you need for a book proposal. I want you to send it to me within a couple months about what are you saying to the world. So part of it is that I teach ideas, but what I say to students is that you get three things from a degree. One is a brand. You're a McGill person. Secondly is a network. And I've known you for years and knew your wife as well and so on. But third, you get education. But I say to them, I'll change my mind in 10 years. So what I taught you 10 or 20 years ago, it's a bit different today, not because I lied, hopefully, but because the world just moved on. So what we think about the new models, the new thinking is different. So the legacy you want to leave with young people is inspiring them, helping them to learn how to think. Because in the senior's home in 70 years, they'll probably be the chair of the board because they'll think better. And it's something where you just go, I want you to think about what's important and how do you get through a problem, get to a good solution. So these are some of the things I leave behind. And it's also the world of ideas. So I was honored last week in the Senate, and it was wonderful. And other books I've written where you leave a legacy of ideas that impact the world a little bit. Like I've written 3 books with a historian on arguing there was no one world globalization in the Roman Empire. And not that many people care, but it's in that history of international business. There's a few more paragraphs in the book saying, actually, there was globalization of a form in the Roman Empire. And so we've kind of like, I mean, it doesn't matter that much, but it's saying we just think about globalization slightly different because of David Lewis and my thinking and writing and going out and talking at conferences and doing press stuff and so on. So if you live in the world of ideas, you want to make the world slightly better through your ideas. But those ideas will age and move on. So but that's what we're building on the shoulders of those who came before us. And so I have students helping with my book that I'm doing a book on Indigenous leadership. They're looking at what does the latest literature say? Because I don't want to reinvent the wheel, or even more fundamentally, say something really stupid because there's evidence that my idea is not up to date. So there's that combination of individuals, like human beings. And I have 3 or 4 meals or coffee a week with alumni who live in Montreal or happen to be in town. And people email and say, hey, I'm in Montreal next week. Do you have coffee? I'm an extrovert, so I enjoy it, but I'm reverse mentored. And it makes me today's person. As you get older, the issue is how do you not become yesterday's person? And when I talk to retired people, like, love them, but like they're just dated in their thinking at times. Now, I have the advantage I have 10 undergraduates or 8 working for me on my books. I teach them. I do a radio show interviewing almost everybody's younger than me other than Henry Mintzberg. So it's something where I'm connecting with them and learning about today's world. You may disagree, but you can smell the gunpowder on me. I come from the battle. And so that's the issue as you get older is staying today's person. And so that's part of the joy of teaching and being with alumni and with young people and just learning from them and what their issues are and what they're thinking about and where their heads are at, man.
How do you think about your legacy with respect to your family, your own kids?
Well, it's something where both have got engaged recently and, you hope they're good marriage partners and they may have kids someday, but, that's up to them and when and where. And, it's also a relationship with a spouse. So my wife, we've been married 30 some odd years. So it's being supportive of her. I know her better than anyone in the world. I mean, her parents are no longer alive, but you realize your wife or husband knows you better than your mom and dad at a certain point because, you're living life with them and you're with them and they know when you're irritated and they say, calm down, David. It's calm down. Just enough. Go away. And you get a good advice from a partner like that. So it's something where you realize that helping them be happy is a central mission of life if you have a life partner like that. But you have an incredible knowledge of them and you can make your wife so mad if you wish, but you have the good judgment not to. But you
Not
just
always.
don't put, well, hopefully, but you don't, like I know the buttons, don't push them. If you can avoid it, and hopefully she does the same for you, most of the time anyway. So those are some of the, legacy. And you want to build an institution at McGill, in my case, where involved a bit in hiring and mentoring younger people so that when you leave, some of those things continue to be part of the conversation and how we do things in the culture. So leaving behind a good culture, it's the CEO's job, but other people contribute to it as well.
You've met a lot of business people. Just interested in your thoughts around what successful business legacies are from a family standpoint when you're passing a business from generation to generation, or where the leaders are part of the same family, whether children or other members. I mean, we have great examples in Canada, like Power Corp and others, but you've met a lot of these people and you talk to them. What do you think makes for a great family business legacy story?
Well, it's interesting because I do a report with the National Bank for the last 4 years on family business with Vincent Jolicoeur, who is a vice chairman and now living in Hong Kong. And so the last one was about the environment. So what is family business doing by the environment? But we start off with Standard & Poor's look at the Toronto Stock Exchange, and family business outperforms non-family business and has for years. The big advantage of the family business is the long view. And I've interviewed, many people where they go, that's my granddaughter over there. I'm preparing her to take it over. And the granddaughter may not want to, and so on. But Lino Saputo, who's now the chair of the board at Saputo, his dad took him when he was a 9 or 10-year-old boy, and he would sweep. Was that, it's what you do at 9 or 10. It's probably illegal, but like if your dad or mom takes you to work, it's fine. We relax about that. And everyone was older by definition. The older men would mentor him because they realized he's going to be our boss someday. Like he's a kid, but someday. And he took it over and grew the business. But his grandfather founded it, and it was just it's something where there's enormous pride about the Saputo story, and he grew it globally, like took it to the next level with big subsidiaries in Australia, um, Argentina, the U.S., and so on. So when we look at family business, there's a famous saying of from short sleeves to wealth to back to short sleeves, you know, and there's some like that where some members of the family don't want to get involved. And I think of some members of the Brofman's family that are involved in the business, others are not. And if you have great wealth, it may be a temptation to not worry about it and just enjoy the money and do good things and live an interesting life. But a lot of them, I see that the third, fourth generation are out there and are building a business for their unborn grandchildren, sort of thing, where that legacy and that you're a Saputo or a Demery or a Brofman or a Molson really matters. And I mean, the Jeff and Andrew Molson own the Canadians. So I was lucky. I go to 2 Canadian games a year. Last week as at one, and I saw Andrew and his wife in the owner's box, right above the players' bench, and they're involved. And I hear great things about Jeff's leadership there as the CEO of the team, but the family had owned it before. So there's that sense of I have a name that I've got to honor, and it's a name where society knows it, so it perhaps even gives greater weight to not screwing up too badly and showing respect for the grandparents and the parents who raised you and things like that. So family business, and there's many, and some families leave out at a certain point and are just on the board. So there's a certain point where you have a non-family CEO like Bombardier, Alain Belmar, and Paul Tellier and so on. But Baudouin family is still the chair of the board is a Baudouin. And they're still on the board and engaged in helping leading it. So we like family business, but we've studied and talked to hundreds and looked at the stats. There are exceptions, but family business is the long view is what every CEO should take away. I'm not in it to make hay while the sun shines, but if you're the CEO and you could be fired in the next 2, like the CEO of Air Canada is stepping down, but it's something where you make hay while the sun shines because you're making millions, but in a year or two, you're retired and it's over. That short-term viewism can impact some CEOs, unfortunately. But I like the long-term view that family business takes.
And what's the advice for every other CEO? And I mean, what's the secret sauce? I mean, is it just family or there's something else that if you're not in a family business, you can actually implement on a day-to-day basis what's the secret sauce of the family business?
It's the long term, and it's saying it may be up to the board to go, how do we compensate the CEO so that he or she is going to take the long view and maybe stock options that vest after a number of years. And it'd be going, you're going to be a wealthy person, but you're going to have even greater wealth if you plant the right seeds for the future. And partly the board is to say, okay, like Michael Rousseau stepping down from Air Canada, it's in 6 months, but there's internal people, and he's 68. So, like, if you're 45, we're not as worried about, but you could get hit by a bus. So every board should think about it. But at 68, there must be people internally that are possible candidates. Partly because if something happens to the CEO and you announce at a press conference, then you got to go, and now Susan's in charge. And you bring her forward. You can't go, no one's in charge. It's, just not a helpful statement made to the media. It's like in the U.S. There's a president, but the president, there's a vice president, but if he died in the same accident, they have it goes down 300 people. But it's something where there's a long line of, and it's the same. If King Charles dies, we know he's going to be king. And at Buckingham Palace, they come out, and I've been there many times living in England, a guard will come out and go, the Queen has died. Moment of silence. Then he goes, long live the king. England will never be without a monarch, you know, and that's what it needs to be, is that kind of succession, and that you're planning your successors, but you're planning their successors by developing young people and in their 30s. So that it's that sense of really a long-term view and going, I need leaders to replace me is what you need to be thinking about on a regular basis.
We should all think like monarchs.
Well, you do act like a king once in a while, but at least you have a queen anyway.
Yes. So, two very interesting things. And I asked you, do you think a lot of good leaders, you said most leaders
Yeah.
don't focus enough on the younger generations, but you also said at the same time that one of the key things is thinking long term. The key things to develop a successful business is to think long term and to think through multiple layers of succession. And so do you feel like one of the key problems we have at the leadership level is that people not thinking enough about the second and the third layer in the organization in terms of developing them? Like, do you think that's a real gap in how most CEOs
No,
think?
I don't think, I think it is a gap in some organizations, but it's something where in class and so on, they talk about it with enthusiasm and they actually seem to know what they're talking about. Like it doesn't seem to be, I'm making this up as I go along, but there's a reality they think about this. And when I talk to HR people, it's part of a lot of HR processes of big companies where HR thinks about this. So could it be better? Absolutely. But I think a fair number of companies and CEOs are thinking about this in a fairly active way. Should they do a bit more? Yes. But it's not as if they're not doing it at all.
We talked a little bit about AI. Would love to hear your thoughts about the broader impact of AI on education. I mean, how, like, I get about like the exams and whatever, but how do you think this will transform education overall?
Well, it's something where you think about AI. When I talk to people, a lot of CEOs, other executives, AI is changing how they do business. And it's actually accounts receivable. Like it's the business, the heart of the business, stuff that we need to do. Like we need to get accounts receivable or we don't get paid. And so it's drilling down into businesses and actual processes that AI can do better. And I know colleagues that are using AI to help write articles. And on the other hand, AI can screw up and doesn't develop original thought as well as human beings. And that's kind of where the human person comes into it more. But the students are using AI to help them in their thinking, to do research and so on. But we're wrestling with how do we use it effectively? And we tend to be a bit conservative in a way because the real world's moving on. And are we moving along? But it's partly we just don't know. Like it's a certain amount you throw your hands up in the air, and go like, I don't know what's the right approach here. Partly because I remember before the internet, I worked for IBM. And I remember technologies, like the cell phone came out. And the first time I remember I was in Helsinki doing work for Nokia, and I saw a person talking in the air. And it was a well dressed man just talking. And you go, normally this would be odd behavior and he might mental health issues, but it was a cell phone. And it was just like, what is this? And Nokia was one of the great pioneers, and I did work with them, so got to know them well. But you go, oh, it's not going to catch on, is what some people said. But you go like, who doesn't have a cell phone? Or who doesn't have an email? If occasionally I meet someone who does have an email, either it's the king or something, who's someone really important, where like I'm not going to have an email because I will get millions a day, or someone really elderly, where you go like, wow. And I was trying to email a book to an older person, and one of the relatives said, "Oh, they don't do email. You're going to have to mail the book." So I did. But you go like, "Wow, that's old. That's really old school." So, we've seen this many times in our lives where we said, some people said cell phones, they're not going to catch on. Why do you need to phone someone? But for 20 years, I had a phone in my office. I don't now. Just one day, the phone disappeared. And occasionally I get voicemails to my old phone number show up, but like I don't know where the person got the number and why they're calling, and it just seems kind of like you give everybody your cell phone. Where 10 years ago might be you give it to your spouse. and your parents, but you don't give it to everybody. Now, my cell phone is my phone, and I turn it off when I go to bed. And I turn down the ringer at dinner if I don't want to be bothered. But occasionally someone important, like, the CBC might phone to interview me. So I go, oh, let me take it. It's the CBC, national news. I'll take that. And a couple of years ago, Paul Martin's office, the prime minister's office, phoned in class, and I went, PMO. I said, guys, I'm going to take this call. Like, I had, and they were just amused that I got a call from some minor functionary at the PMO. But you go, like, the prime minister calls, I'm going to take their call. Like, if Mark Carney wants my advice, I will give it. This is not going to happen. But, just something in a moment of optimism. You go, like, you never know. So the world just goes on, and I've seen many technologies come and be central to our life, and new technologies will replace them. But the word Google was a silly word 20 years ago. Now we Google everything. And if I want to know something new about you, I just Google it, or I might AI, what's new with David? And it would tell me. And, my wife and I are discussing something, and I didn't know what it is. So I just Googled it, and it came up, and here we are, and we had a little conversation. But, that's what you do these days. And there'll be new technologies. It may be AI implanted in your brain or something, which sounds weird today, but I think in 15 or 20 years, that may be what it is. So, but I grew up in a technology company, IBM, big technology company of its day. So I love technology, and I made a lot of money at it. That's why you have a nice house. And I have a naive, optimistic view about technology. But then again, the atomic bomb destroyed Hiroshima, but also gives us nuclear energy, which may be a good part of the solution of climate change if we can just make nuclear safe or feel it's safe. And we'd like it to be safe as well.
I haven't been reviewing the management curriculum, but I remember 15 years ago, we didn't talk that much about climate in the context of
Yeah.
broad management education. Like, has it changed now? Like, is it something where it's front and center, or is it still kind of like a one topic amongst
No,
25 that are
it's
addressed?
not the only topic, but it is probably the first topic on my students' minds from, having coffee with them, discussing things. What are you doing? And what's your job after graduation? And questions like that. And it comes up a lot in class. And we have, study centers here around the environment at McGill. So there's other issues. Another big one is healthcare. And that's announcing an institute this week at McGill around healthcare and bringing management thinking to the healthcare system. EDI is a big thing. How we treating minorities, and so on. So there are other big issues, but the environment is certainly one of the very leading ones, without a doubt. And in my view and what I hear, it is at McGill among the students and increasing number of faculty as well.
Carl, thank you so much for joining us on this podcast, and always a pleasure. And I know I will be visiting your own show in the next couple of months, so we'll see each other again.
Look forward to it.
So that was very interesting, Sarah. Like, one thing that really stood out for me was this idea that family businesses are more successful because of the long view. I think that pairs well also with Carl's comments about the importance of succession planning. I think that's the same theme. Like the theme is go beyond the immediate need and think about second, third, fourth order implications of whatever it is you're doing in terms of the long-term sustainability of a business.
Yeah. When you think about, obviously we talk about legacy all the time and how, you might define legacy differently, but it's super interesting to think of a business in terms of not just, succession planning for, the viability and the growth of the business, but succession planning for your own family's, benefit for generations to come. You have future generations that are going to work there, that are going to run the company, that are going to be involved in the ongoing management of the company for years and years to come. And in those cases, this is where, the business succession planning and, the overall estate planning and legacy planning are really so closely intertwined.
I think they're the same thing, like in the end, because you have to think about them together.
Absolutely.
And we come back to like these family meetings and conversations. I mean, I don't think a lot of people have the mechanism, at least the first generation, to actually fully address that properly. I think by the third generation, those mechanisms are in place and it's kind of part of the DNA of the family. But I think the first generation is a lot harder. Most people don't start a business thinking it's going to be a multi-generational family business. I think I don't.
Yeah. They might hope. They might hope.
They might hope, but they don't think so.
Yeah.
So it's probably something that comes a little bit later. But then you didn't develop the muscle. It's like estate planning. Like you didn't develop the muscle. You don't think about this every day. So it's not natural, which can cause problems in the context of estate planning. So interesting that Karl is saying, think like a monarch. Think, if you're hit by a bus, there needs to be a replacement. And then if that person is hit by a bus, there needs to be a replacement. And that kind of thinking, it's what we say all the time in estate planning, which is like you may get hit by a bus, and therefore you should have a plan in place. I thought that was very interesting and very related to or very relevant to the conversation we're having on this podcast. Any other thoughts, Sarah, on Karl and the conversation?
It was super interesting to hear about sort of how thinking has evolved, and I love how much Karl clearly prioritizes hearing from young folks and the diverse perspectives. But that specifically, hearing from young people is actually how you, and reverse mentorship is actually how you make yourself better. I think that's not necessarily, commonly held or promoted in terms of, importance. So I really liked hearing about that. And also some of the trends that he was mentioning, which are not at all, surprising to me, around more sort of values-based and social awareness and thinking about how businesses exist in the context of, the world around us. All of that I find, super, super interesting, and also glad to see because it's an important direction in my view.
We're happy to see that young people are thinking about quote unquote the right things.
Yes.
But I did note something. I think part of the subtext was there's high anxiety though, in young people, and it's going to be hard, and we can't afford a house, and we can't do this, and therefore, because there's high anxiety and because the world is harder, people are redefining success just because
they have to.
They have to. The whole model of success doesn't exist, and therefore that's kind of sad as well. So
agreed.
I noticed that Karl, in the name of all boomers, claim climate change. So boomer legacy. Love that. All right. So don't forget to share and subscribe to The Endgame by Clear Estate on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. Thanks so much, Sarah. And thanks everybody for joining us.
ThinkBait. TNKR Media. Good talk.